Look how they mess with my boy.
Look what they've done to my boy. NVIDIA is down to $120 per share today, which is a $24 difference in share price, which is 17%. Now it's gone up slightly in the after hour, but not nearly enough to be called recuperating. It's only gone up 1.2% in after hours. But where did this come from, right? This is insane. NVIDIA last night was the biggest company in the world, over $3 trillion in market cap, and that seemingly changed over the course of one night. Now they're at $2.92 trillion in market cap, so they lost hundreds of billions worth of market cap within a single trading day, which is absolutely insane, and I'm sure it's going to be up there with some of the biggest losses, and yeah, it's just absolutely insane. So let's kind of talk about what happened. I like to operate under the assumption that the market is rational, so there must be a reason why the top stock and one of the best performers in the last 2 years has dropped 17% in a single day. And people are citing the reason to be a competitor of OpenAI called DeepSeek. Basically, it operates in the same way that you can imagine ChatGPT operates, but it's much more efficient and cheaper and better at the end of the day too, like in the actual results. So that kind of comes with a lot of concerns for NVIDIA because NVIDIA supplies the chips to these companies that build these models and are integrating them in their sites, their social medias, or just in their company. So NVIDIA is directly tied to them in this kind of situation. But let's go over some of the results here that I wrote down of DeepSeek so we kind of understand how big of a difference this is. They had a 96% reduction in token cost, which is basically the cost to run a prompt. When you imagine you ask ChatGPT a question and it gives you an answer, there's a cost of that. And it's actually very extensive and it's a lot on the power grid because it has to go through all this information and fine tune it with a really fine comb and make sure you get the best, most accurate answer with the least chance of error. That costs a lot of money to do for every single response. So basically, they reduced that cost by 96%. And at the same time, they had better results on the benchmarks. So, yeah, it dropped 96% of the cost and have better results. That's just insane. And what this kind of means is that less chips will be needed because this model was built with significantly less chips, apparently. And a lot of companies are going to be caught with their pants down with the sunk cost, and we'll see if they operate on that fallacy or not, because they just invested billions of dollars into these data centers and chips from NVIDIA and GPUs and all that. Billions of dollars because that's what was expected of them by the shareholder at the time. And now maybe they didn't have to do that much, or they might be outdated in some regards, and there might be a new method on the horizon because a lot of this is still hush hush. It has just come to the news this weekend, and we're seeing the results this trading day. Basically, the difference between ChatGPT, Llama, Grok, all that, and DeepSeek is the fact that DeepSeek uses synthetic data. So they have a pool of data that they draw from, which is very standard for these models. That's how they get their answers. And instead of looking for more data and constantly trying to collect it, they rather generate samples from that data and they use those samples to generate responses. Which, if you study statistics, it feels very weird because you don't want to do that necessarily because you can get overfitting and just reaffirm your model if you have just generated results from what you already have. But I suppose in the case of AI, it doesn't really matter. Google themselves said that something like synthetic data is actually a really good way to go about it. And apparently we've seen that, and it's also incredibly cheaper than the competitors. Another thing that they have is something called chain of thought. So I got DeepSeek pulled up here, and you want to make sure you have deep think on. And basically this shows you the train of thought. So you can imagine when you're working through a problem, you can't just simply go from point A to point B. There's going to be point A, point B, point C, point D, all the way to point whatever. There's all these little thoughts you have in between. So we're going to ask it a pretty deep question. What is the purpose of life? Okay, so let's see what DeepSeek says. And now normally you'd be used to ChatGPT taking a second and then just spitting out the answer for you. Rather, we're seeing the thinking process here. So we can read this. Okay, so first user is asking, what is the purpose of life? That's a big question. Let me start by breaking it down. First, I need to consider different perspectives because this isn't a question with a straightforward answer. It goes talking about a philosophical standpoint, scientific angle, cultural differences. And then the answer varies on personal beliefs. But you can see how all that comes into the actual answer down here. So it explains not only what the answer is, but where it's pulling that information from, for one, and two, why it's pulling that information. Why is it relevant? So this could be helpful in something like solving problems, because you don't want to just jump to the answer, especially for code. It might not make sense to just jump to the answer, but you'd rather want to understand the fundamental code and how you worked about it so it can seem more organic and you can hopefully learn yourself and don't need the AI. But this is something that ChatGPT just simply doesn't do. It might explain a little bit in the answer, right? It might incorporate purposes of like parts of this, but it doesn't give it to the user. And maybe they're doing that to retain their moat or just not show the customer. Maybe they felt like they'd be too overwhelmed if they're seeing this, because this can get quite long if it's a very difficult question. Purpose of life apparently isn't too difficult when straight to the point. But all that is to say is this is something we haven't seen from ChatGPT. It seems like the consumer actually likes it quite a bit. It feels a little more human because it gives you a reason behind everything. It doesn't just spit out an answer that you just take at face value. This gives context behind it. And that's very important when it comes to AI because we've been lacking context. It's just been a robot that we've just kind of blindly trusted. And all this is also to say that DeepSeek was only trained on $6 million worth of data. So instead of companies spending billions of dollars, they said, hey, it only took us about $6 million to train this model, which is just mind-blowing because OpenAI on ChatGPT spends billions and billions trying to retain their mode and stay on top of the competition. Well, little dog came up, now he's big dog, and just blew him out of the water completely by doing it about a different method, which I'm really surprised something like ChatGPT hasn't done. I'm sure they've thought about it. Google's talked about it, so hopefully we'll see a little switch over to this, and maybe the services can get a lot cheaper because I know ChatGPT is quite expensive on their the plans they offer. So now, why did NVIDIA drop? Right, that's the question. All this context is very important, obviously, but why did it actually drop? Okay, so first, what we're going to talk about is, let's see, discounted cash flow models. Pardon my handwriting. And that basically means that value today is equal to value in the future divided by opportunity cost. Okay, so this is to say that the value today is equal to the revenue of next year plus the revenue of the following year, so on. So we'll say revenue of year one, revenue of year two, revenue of year three. I'm just saying revenue, but realistically it's earnings because you want to capture the fact of losing money because it costs money to run a business. And then opportunity cost is basically, you can imagine like market return. So we would estimate market return to be maybe from 7 to 10%, but we'll just say market return for those years. So if you just put your money in S&P for the year, you're going to get 7 to 10%, but it does vary. So you had a big opportunity cost if you weren't invested in the last 2 years, but the years before that, it won't be such a big deal because the market didn't really bring back a lot. So the way that this is affected is the revenue, because we're looking for the value today. And in this case, we're concerned about the revenue because that's what's going to be changing. The opportunity cost is going to be the same regardless. Whatever happens in the market is going to happen in it, whether or not you invest in this company, whether or not this company's making money, the market's still going to act that way. Independent of this situation that NVIDIA is so big, it does affect the market. But we can see that the revenues is what changes. So let's look and see what factors of their revenue, and we got the chart on the left, is affected by this. Okay, this is affected. This is affected. 3D visualization maybe a little bit. This isn't affected down here. And cryptocurrency mining, not affected because they still have their moat, because their GPUs are very powerful and they are leading the world in GPUs, but are they needed? Now that's the question. So first, let's look at this first section. We got data center processors. Okay, basically, if the processing power of these models can be considerably less because it doesn't require as much processing, and that is reflected in the token price, companies don't necessarily need data centers as much. They don't need as robust data centers as they have been building. And I mentioned the point that a lot of these companies had their initial capital expenditure for these data centers. So they had to spend a lot of money up front because they don't have the infrastructure, but going into the future, they won't need it as much because they already spent that 10 billion to get that facility, those 2 facilities down, maybe a couple million a year, a billion maybe, to maintain the operations there, but it's not the same kind of expense. So that's already a concern of it, and now they might not need as robust of data centers. Okay, so this revenue, which incorporates 78% in 2022, we can see, is very, very affected because let me remind you that 96% of the cost for DeepSeek is gone. So it's 96% cheaper than its top competitor, OpenAI's ChatGPT model. GPUs for computer. Okay. Who are the people buying these? You got Google, you got Meta, you got X. These companies that are building their own language models or LLMs, they're going to need GPUs. They need to compute that. As we've seen from this number here, they don't need as many GPUs for computing. Simple as that. So data centers are their own thing where they need that computing power. Okay, computing power is going to go down as is, but GPUs for computers, they're also not going to have as high of a demand because not as many GPUs are needed due to a lower computing cost. 96% decrease apparently in the cost of a token for a language model or for AI. So this is also going to be affected quite greatly. So if we look at those two numbers, 95.1% of NVIDIA's current revenue can be affected by this. Now, how much it is, we don't know necessarily, right? We don't know. We've seen that NVIDIA dropped 17% today, so you would assume kind of around that is what the market's expecting, 17. You just get like a range of error. Let's say 14 to 20% of revenue will be affected by this situation. And by affected, I mean decreased. If it was going to be affected as in going up, the price would go up. So we're expecting maybe 14 to 20% of their revenue being decreased. Now that's important because of the fact that, in my opinion, NVIDIA was already overvalued. It raced up very quickly for good reason because the revenues were high and their profits were great and they had a great moat, but they had to retain high growth in the coming decade. In this situation, this doesn't scream high growth to me. This isn't a company that the world is going to be necessarily dependent on like we thought. So we valued them under the situation that the world was going to revolve around NVIDIA. And it might still revolve around NVIDIA to a certain aspect, but as much as I think as prior, no. I don't think it will be as needed. So that's kind of like the revenue breakdown of it. And we can see that, I mean, this even had like trickling effects onto other industries. Well, in the industry to other companies. AMD is down 6% today. Gosh, Meta is down. Oh, Meta's up. Okay, so that's great to see. But I know for a fact, Google, which I've been buying into, is down 4% for the day. Palantir is down 4% for the day. So we saw a big market shock kind of all across the S&P 500, but especially the NASDAQ 100, which is down 3% for the day, which is quite significant. So a lot of news. This is incredible. I think it's a great technological breakthrough and finally gives us that needed competition because NVIDIA was sitting at the top a little too comfortable. They need to get that fire under them and get shook up a little bit, in my opinion. So this is good in general, but concerning for the US if they were hoping to be the front leaders of AI as they thought they were years ahead of the competition. Turns out competition right under their nose was actually ahead of them. So we'll see how that all plays out. It's going to be an incredible, interesting next month. We'll see at the end of this month when I do my portfolio recap how that looks. But But I think by the end of next month, we're really going to be seeing something happen here. What that is, I have zero idea, but I'm excited to see it nonetheless. So thank you for tuning in. Make sure to like, subscribe, share with your friends, and all that. Ask questions in the comment. Love to answer them. And I will see you guys in my recap video.